Welcome back. In this video, Bishop Barron is explaining the two places any person should start if they want to reach the younger generations with the Christian faith. He posits two things. One, show the positive relationship between science and religion. And number two is appeal to objective moral values. Now, Barron explains these brilliantly with lots of great citations and insights. So be sure to stick around and hear what he has to say. All right, that's all I have. Please be sure to like and subscribe and enjoy the video.
Somehow we, and by we here I mean all of us involved in religious education, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, everything else, that somehow we have not communicated well to our young people that there is a very richly intellectual tradition around this question. So I said there are 24, there are many more than that too. Can I just explore with you two approaches to God? And my starting point for each one is going to be something that I think young people find especially compelling. So let me just talk about two of them. The first one begins with the sciences. And I'm being purposely a little bit provocative here because, boy, one thing you hear from the young people is, well, science disproves religion. You know, religion makes all these kooky claims, and then science came along, and boy, it's got, empirical analysis, and it forms hypotheses in a responsible way. It does experiments, it draws conclusions. We have testable results, and the sciences have produced the technology. It's working right now for all of us, but from the iPhone that every kid has in his pocket, it's produced a technology which has made life so much richer and better and more comfortable. And so, heck, the sciences seem great. And haven't they disproven religion? And they look at religion, and again, I heard this like crazy on the Reddit forum. These old texts from the ancient world that seem so crazy and contradictory, and so much has been debated and unresolved and murky. So you get that. Religion seems kind of shaky and ancient and questionable, and then the sciences seem so smart and testable and beneficial. So if it's a war between religion and science on those terms, guess who's going to win? And the kids say it all the time. Science is better than religion. Science disproves religion. Okay. And I've talked about this in I can't go into all the details about religion and science, but what I want to do here is to start actually with the sciences. Start at the very heart of all the sciences. What is the basic assumption? And I would call it, everybody, frankly, a mystical assumption that stands behind all the sciences. Whether it's psychology, it's biology, it's chemistry, it's physics, whatever it is, the assumption that stands behind all the sciences is that reality is intelligible. Fancy way of saying it can be known. It has a pattern that corresponds to the questing mind. Now think about it for a second. If the world was just a chaotic jumble, well, how would the scientists go out to meet it? With what kind of confidence? If the world was just chaotic jumble of nonsense, no scientific mind would go out to meet it with confidence. Rather, there's something like pattern, form, intelligibility on the grandest possible scheme and in every nook and cranny of the universe. In fact, isn't it interesting? I remember talking to my nephew. My nephew Drew is a really smart kid. He's a senior now at MIT. So doing the highest level, right, math and physics and all that stuff. And I said, Drew, what I find really interesting is that reality, as you're analyzing it, as an engineer now, corresponds to the most complex mathematics. As you're analyzing the world, so you can build bridges and build buildings and construct things and so on. Well, you're using the most sophisticated, complex mathematics to do that work. Well, why does it work that way? Why would that complex mathematics correspond to the real world that you're dealing with? Where does the order, pattern, and intelligibility of the world come from? You know, Einstein said this. He has a lot of interesting quotes about kind of science and religion, but my favorite is this one. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, right? Because the more you stare at that, the stranger it becomes, right? Why should the world have these incredibly complex mathematical patterns of intelligibility? But it does, because otherwise the sciences wouldn't even get off the ground. Joseph Ratzinger, in his wonderful Introduction to Christianity, of course, Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict XVI. Ratzinger says, the only finally satisfying explanation for the intelligibility of the world is some intelligence which has placed that patternness, that order, that intelligibility into things. Ratzinger observed something, I've always loved this. He said, our language gives this away. Because when we come to know something, we say that we recognize it, right? I recognize the truth of that. Recognize, recognize, right? I think again what's already been thought. Now, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and through that Word all things came to be. The great claim of the Bible is the world is not dumbly there. The world is intelligibly there because it has been spoken into being. Don't literalize that language. That's beautiful high poetry to express what I've just been describing. The world's not dumbly there. It's not chaotically there, but rather it's intelligibly there because it's been known into being by a great primordial intelligence. Another thing that's interesting, everybody, many have pointed out, Ratzinger included, it's no accident that the modern physical sciences that we all honor and reverence as we should, emerged when and where they did, which is to say, out of the great Christian universities of Europe. They came out of a thought world that took for granted creation. The idea that all of reality has been stamped by a primordial intelligence. And look at the first great scientists, almost without exception. They were all devoutly religious people because the sciences came up out of that matrix. I'll leave you just with this quote from Paul Davies. Paul Davies is a very interesting Australian physicist, high-level physicist, but writes a lot about science and religion. He wrote an article where he was kind of tweaking the noses of his scientific colleagues. And his simple question was this: where do you think the laws of nature come from? That's a good question. So he's making the point that I'm trying to make here, that all of the sciences rest upon the assumption that there's a law-like quality to reality. Where's that come from? How do you explain that? I might suggest it's a good way for our young people who are properly enamored of the sciences to see the link between science and religion. They're not enemies. No, in fact, religion is right there at the very heart of science if we look at it the right way. Okay, here's my second approach. So that's the first one, through science. The second one also starts with something I think almost all young people take for granted and reverence. I'm talking about the objectivity of moral value. The objectivity of moral value. Now, I don't mean here that we should start with the church's sexual teaching. They don't like the church's sexual teaching. So that comes through in every single survey. I'm not saying the church's sexual teaching is wrong. I don't think it's wrong. But the young people don't like it. So I wouldn't recommend starting with that. However, almost without exception, they do like the great values of social justice, don't they? You talk to young people, what really motivates them? That there are these great social justice values, that you shouldn't abuse the poor and the marginalized, that you should not be sexist, that you should not be oppressive, that something like slavery is clearly wrong, that human trafficking, that's a terrible thing. Racism, that's wrong. I mean, I don't know one young person that would disagree with any of that. Do you? Well, what they're acknowledging is there's an objective moral value involved there. If you were to say, no, I think morality is just a question of, your subjective opinion. So, yeah, you think slavery is a bad thing, but if someone else thinks slavery is okay, well, that's all right. We should be tolerant and inclusive. I don't know one young person that would say that. Do you? Or, sexism, sure, I think that's wrong. It's my subjective opinion. But someone else, they might think, no, sexism is fine. Would they buy that? Or, the Nazis, yeah, sure, I think that's a terrible thing what Hitler did. But, if that was the consensus of the people of that time, who am I to tell them when they're wrong? I don't know any young person that would ever say such a thing. You see, what they're resisting, and they're dead right about it, they're resisting the tendency to turn objective moral value into simply a matter of subjective preference. Now, I know, we so highly value inclusivity and diversity and all those good things. But when it comes to these primal moral truths, I don't find young people subjectivist at all. I think they hold to objective moral value. Okay, just as in the scientific order, where do the laws of nature come from? Where do these objective intelligibilities come from? So here now, in the moral order, where do these objective moral values come from? Oh, they just come from the societal consensus. No. Because 1935 in Germany, there was a societal consensus that it was perfectly fine to imprison Jews and put them to death. Oh, no, that's just, a matter of subjective opinion. No, you don't hold that. You hold to the objectivity of these values. Where do they come from? How do you explain them? What does the Bible witness to, everybody, over and over again? That God is the great lawgiver that stands behind the objective moral laws that we intuit. How is God described? As the giver of commandments. Now again, I know right away they think sexual morality and tell me what to do. So bracket sexual morality for a moment. Go back to these things I've been talking about. Do you think slavery, human trafficking, racism are objectively wrong? Yeah. Where does that come from? Where did those objective states of affairs come from? They can't come from my private opinion. They can't come from the consensus of my community. They come, in fact, the Bible says, from this great moral lawgiver whom we call God. Just a last connection. Isn't it interesting? John Henry Newman saw this. That we refer to the conscience as a voice. Think about that. It's curious because, I've got, let's say, an aesthetic sensibility where I make judgments about works of art. And, that's beautiful, and that's it, and that's not, or that's more beautiful than this. Okay, now, if I make a mistake in that order, I don't feel ashamed. I might feel stupid or I might feel, uninformed or something, but I don't feel ashamed that I made a bad aesthetic judgment. Or if I make a mistake in my mathematical calculation, I might feel stupid, but not ashamed. But when I go against objective moral value, how do I feel? Not just stupid or uninformed, I feel ashamed. Now, why? Because I know I've offended someone. You see what the voice of conscience, not just an attitude or a sensibility, it's a voice. It's someone who has given these objective moral values to the world. And when I run counter to them, I feel under judgment. Now, turn it around, make it positive. When I do something right, when I liberate someone who's oppressed, when I fight against racism, when I fight against all forms of slavery, what do I feel? Well, not just, hey, that was a right judgment. No, I feel joyful in the presence of someone who approves of this. Where do physical laws come from? The great intelligence that placed them there. Where do moral laws come from? From the great moral lawgiver in whose presence I feel lifted up or ashamed, depending on how I behave morally. Now, can I suggest, fellow teachers, start with these two approaches. There are many more you could use, but start with these two. Start with two things that they reverence, the sciences and objective moral values. And then keep pushing. Where do they come from? What explains them? What grounds them? I think at the very least, you're going to have a cool discussion. You have an interesting, engaged discussion.